Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Today on CityCast Philly, I can guarantee you that if you've been driving on 95 or 76, you've seen an ad for a personal injury lawyer. You've probably seen hundreds. Top Dog, Lehocky, or John Morgan. Well, technically Morgan & Morgan. My guest today, Tom McGrath, contributing writer at Philly Mag, actually counted the dozens of billboards for lawyers on 95 and thought, why are there so many? His new article is headlined, Billboard Wars, How Personal Injury Lawyers Took Over Philly. It's Tuesday, February 18th. I'm Trenae Nuri, and here's what Philly's talking about. Tom, you decided to take a drive on 95 and count the billboards that have advertising for injury lawyers. Were they annoying to you?
Well, I'm not sure if they were annoying, but there were so many of them that I just couldn't help but notice them. And so it took a while before I took the trip where I actually started to count them. I spent a couple of months driving just going, yep, there's another one, or there's another one. And finally I was, and the reason I started to write this article was because I was just so curious. Why is this happening? So as part of the article, I then got out my notebook and started making tally marks as I drove up and down 95 and counted all those billboards. How
many did you count?
I think I counted 32 going one direction, and then I turned around and headed the other direction and counted 33, which is over the space of maybe 8 or 9 miles, I think. So it's a lot.
Do all billboards just show that a lot of Philadelphians are getting injured or dying due to car injuries or medical malpractice or a slip and fall?
Well, I think it may speak to some of that, but I think it speaks even more to lawyers trying to capture more business. So I'm not sure that there is more causes of action happening in Philadelphia as much as it is lawyers trying to capture more business. And also they're fighting amongst themselves now for some of this business. And advertising has now almost become table stakes for a lot of these personal injury firms.
I mean, I see these billboards too, and there are a few, but there's one in particular that I roll my eyes at. It's the Morgan & Morgan ones, because as you say in your article, this particular law firm tries to kind of show or prove their Philly-ness. What are these messages on these billboards telling us?
It depends to some extent on the individual law firm. So Morgan & Morgan is a really good example because they're headquartered in Florida, but at this point, they're really a national law firm. And I think part of the strategy of, trying to show how Philly they are, I mean, the main partner is named John Morgan, but, he's now known as John Morgan to try and show how Philly is, or he puts a Phillies cap on, or it's really to ingratiate themselves into the lives of Philadelphia and Philadelphia culture so that if you think you have one of these cases, that you reach out to Morgan & Morgan. I'd say more broadly, and this is truer among the more local firms that are advertising, the messaging tends to come down to, hey, have you been injured in any way, whether it's in a car accident, whether it's in a slip and fall case, whether you've been hurt at work, whether there's a medical malpractice thing, and then trying to say, hey, you may have a case, you may be owed money. And if that's the case, then come and call us and we will fight on your behalf.
Is there a particular demographic of Philadelphians that these billboards are trying to target?
I think they would say, that it's across the board, anyone who has had one of these things potentially happen to them. I think probably more specifically, though, they're trying to reach out to people that may not be aware that they could potentially have a case. So whether that's, people that are less familiar with the legal system or have less education. It also may depend on the firm in some cases. I mean, a lot of these firms, some of them are just dependent on kind of a volume business. So it could be they're just looking for smaller cases, whereas some of the other firms are looking for really big multi-million-dollar kind of cases. So I think it depends a little bit on the law firm itself.
Okay, so these law firms are competing against each other. Would you say this like a billboard war?
Oh, for sure. At this point, we are in an arms race for personal injury lawyer advertising. And it really started, For decades and decades, the lawyers were not allowed to advertise at all. The American Bar Association, like more than 100 years ago, had this sort of edict says no advertising. That got changed roughly 50 years ago. And over a couple of decades, you started to see a little bit of advertising on TV. In the old yellow pages, you would see it. But the sort of current world that we're in really started probably, at least in Philly, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, when Morgan & Morgan, who we just talked about, came into the market and started doing really a lot of billboards and a lot of other advertising. And it forced local firms in Philadelphia that suddenly saw that they were losing some market share to kind of get in the game. And now, once you get a couple of in there, then there's a third, then there's a fourth, and now they're sort of all in there. And it's not only competing against each other, but what they're also trying to do is expand the market in general. Their theory is that there are people out there that may have a cause of action that don't know it. And so we're going to try to just grow the overall number of cases, whether an individual firm gets that business or not.
All right, more on these billboard wars after the break.
What sort of promises have you made to yourself this year? Maybe get in better shape or eat healthier, save more money, travel somewhere new. What about discovering a new culture by learning a new language? With Babbel, you can do that in just a few weeks. I'm CityCast CEO David Plotz, and I'm having such a good time learning Spanish on Babbel this year. I'm taking a trip to Mexico City in the spring, and Babbel is giving me the Spanish foundation that's going to make my trip so much better. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by more than 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks, or at whatever pace you choose. And because conversing is the key to really understanding each other in a new language, Babbel is designed using practical, real-world conversations. And one way they do that is with their own podcasts. I'm a podcast listener. I'm guessing since you're listening to this podcast, you are too. And I have been getting ready for my Mexico City trip by listening to Babbel's conversational podcasts. There's a short conversation you listen to, then an instructor talks you through what happened, and then you listen again, and then you catch everything when you listen that second time. There's also a great read-along transcript, too, which I love. The one I did today was with Maria and Carmela trying to make dinner plans, but Carmela is so busy. She's way too busy with work and yoga, but finally they agreed on brunch on Saturday. Studies from Yale, Michigan State, and other universities continue to prove that Babbel works. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. So let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting CityCast listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
So, Tom, you counted about 33 billboards, northbound and southbound. But like, what else did you notice on these billboards? What about, I don't know, the colors, who's on the billboard, the font?
There's kind of a range. So you have some that are fairly sort of subdued, sophisticated. Pond Lehocky, whom I focus on in the article, is a really big advertiser. And most of their billboards anyway are fairly straightforward. It's mostly type. They have a pretty simple message. It has the firm's logo on there. They're sort of dignified billboards. In contrast, you have Top Dog Law. While their signage is really bright yellow, it really jumps out at you as just a sign. And then most of it has the photo of James Helm, who was the founder of Top Dog Law. His face there often, in some ways, looks like he's almost like baring his teeth, sort of like a dog. And though his messaging tends to be a little bit just more aggressive, it's not subdued. It's kind of that really in your face. Top dog gets you top dollar. It's a pretty in your face kind of messaging. And then there's some goofier ones there in there that you see too. I'm forgetting the firm now, but there's a lawyer who's bald who plays up his baldness. It's like any billboard, right? They're really just trying to get your attention and get you to sort of focus on whatever it is that they're selling.
And not only are personal injury lawyers on billboards that are on 95. I hear the commercials on Power 99 FM, and I see them if my nail salon has daytime TV on, or even on SEPTA buses rolling down the block. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the billboards have become the most visible thing in the last couple of years, just because we've gone from kind of there were one or two, and now there are literally dozens of these. But yeah, it's everywhere. You know, those radio commercials that you refer to, I've heard some of those too, and the ones for Top Dog, they're hilarious, right? They're really entertaining.
I can hear the song playing in my head right now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's very that's very non-traditional for lawyers to advertise in that kind of very entertaining way. A lot of these firms have really built up their social media followings to try and reach people that way. So you kind of just can't escape the messaging at this point. I mean, they're all over TV as well. So it's just sort of now it's ubiquitous that you sort of see all of these ads. And, I make the point in the story that for a long time in Philadelphia, we used to sort of treat our TV news anchors as celebrities. And I feel like lawyers have now become, almost household names in that way that, the anchor of NBC 10 News used to be.
Tom, do you know which advertising platform is best or more lucrative for lawyers in our area?
Short answer is no. I think in some cases, the firms do a lot to sort of measure as much as they can where business is coming from. And certainly if you run digital advertising, that's pretty easy to measure. You can get very sophisticated analytics about whether your Instagram ad has driven people to reach out to you. It's much less sophisticated when it comes to something like billboards. And so I don't think there's any definitive answer, but I think there's little question that overall, the combination of all of this messaging is definitely increasing the amount of activity we're seeing in the legal field.
At the end of the day, this is a business and businesses need clients to operate. These lawyers, though, are winning big dollars, right? There were 12 personal injury cases just in Philly just last year where the jury awarded verdicts of more than $10 million.
For sure. We're definitely seeing an increase, first of all, in the number of cases. There was some interesting studies about this that over I think roughly the last decade, there's been a 10% increase in the number of cases where juries find in favor of the plaintiff, the person who's bringing the case. And then we're definitely seeing an increase in these really, really big, what they call nuclear verdicts. So as you said, more than $10 million. Now, it's hard to draw direct correlation that because there was a billboard on 95, now suddenly we have another $10 million verdict. But there's definitely correlations. And I think you can make the case that it's sort of changing the culture in some ways that might be sort of leading to some of these results that we're seeing.
Okay, so what's wrong with this form of advertising for their services? What's kind of shady about it in your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that there's anything per se wrong about it. It's certainly not illegal. They have free speech rights to do this. I think where people get a little uncomfortable with it, and this includes not only me, but a lot of lawyers that I talk to, and either just sort of regular people, is that if you back up a second, you said that law is a business, and there's no question that it is. But law, if you turn the clock back several decades, lawyers didn't think of themselves as business people. They thought of themselves as professionals, which is a slightly different thing, right? When you're a professional, the idea is that, first of all, you're doing something that seems to have some broader good for the public, right? And that beyond that, there's a set of rules and standards and ethics that you're agreeing to abide by. That has changed pretty significantly, particularly in the last 3 or 4 decades. And we're really now at the point where lawyers, to your point, really just do, many of them anyway, at least really do see themselves as business people, as corporations. And I think part of the reason we're seeing this, not just the rise in billboards, but marketing in general, is that they're now just trying to market themselves the way any other product or service would. So in terms of if there's anything wrong with it, I get the fact that they're trying to increase business for themselves. And, that's the capitalistic system that we live in. So from that standpoint, there isn't. Where I sort of get concerned about this is that there is, I think, a cultural impact when you see so much of this messaging over and over and over again, where it says, hey, have you been injured? Did something bad happen to you? It may not be your fault. You might be able to get money for this. And I think over time, as I wrote in the story, it sort of compels us to start looking at the world in the way that trial lawyers do, which is by nature in an adversarial way, as opposed to we're all in this together, and yes, bad things happen, and maybe somebody's at fault. And again, there's plenty of legitimate lawsuits that should be brought, but not every accident that happens necessarily is the fault of some large corporation or even you because somebody slipped on your sidewalk, right? There are just things, sometimes things could happen. So my concern about this is just sort of the cultural messaging that it sends out.
What about, maybe another kind of negative consequences that there's higher malpractice insurance premiums? Can you explain how that affected the number of doctors in Pennsylvania in the early 2000s?
Sure. Yeah, there are definitely economic costs. So when you see the number of lawsuits rise, and when you see like things like jury verdicts get larger and larger, somebody's paying for that. And so to use the specific example you just brought up, I mean, 20 years ago in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia specifically, we really had a crisis when it came to the number of medical malpractice cases that were being brought, to the extent that, first of all, malpractice insurance that doctors buy in order to protect themselves, the cost of those premiums was going through the roof. And many of them were saying, I can't do this anymore, many doctors. And they were either switching specialties or they were literally moving out of the state of Pennsylvania. So suddenly there was a crisis when it came to the actual healthcare that Pennsylvanians were getting. The legislature and the Supreme Court stepped in and made some changes that sort of solved that crisis. But it's an example of, somebody actually does pay for these lawsuits. Another example I cite in the story is, we've seen pretty significant increases in the last 5 or 6 years just in car insurance premiums. Now, there's a range of factors for that, just overall inflation. But one of the factors that the insurance industry cites is this rising number of cases and bigger verdicts, which, if they're going to shell out $10 million to somebody because they were involved in a car accident, well, ultimately that cost basically just gets passed on to the consumer. So there is a broader economic hit that all of us take when you have this much activity in the legal system.
I'm curious, you also write that billboards in general, they're having this moment. Why? And is it true that digital billboards read our phones while we're driving by?
Yeah, so I have to say that my initial curiosity in this story was, first of all, why are all these lawyers advertising so much? But the other part of it was, why are they using billboards? I mean, not like the most antiquated way of advertising, right? When you can target somebody on their phone down to sort of like the neighborhood they live in, why are they suddenly just putting up a big sign on the side of the highway? But I discovered a lot about the billboard business as I researched this story. So back to your point, yeah, first of all, the digital billboards that we see, the ones where the messaging can change really quickly, those, when you drive past them, they pick up the ID on your phone and can then retarget you with the same advertising that you saw. So you can be driving on 995 and see an ad for some law firm. The billboard picks up the ID on your phone, and 20 minutes later, when you're looking at your Instagram feed, suddenly there's an ad from that same law firm. And that's no accident. That's because that's the way digital advertising can work. But beyond that, even with the more traditional billboards, which are very static, one person I talked to who's in the business said that's very appealing to advertisers because it's kind of the one form of advertising these days that we can't really ignore, right? You can block ads on the internet, you can swipe through something really quickly on your phone, you can fast forward through something on TV. But if you're driving, you have to pay attention and you can't help but see these giant signs. So I think that's one reason that sort of the billboards, even traditional billboards, are kind of, having a pretty nice moment for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's true that they are sometimes distracting. I'm curious, though, what ways would you prefer injury lawyers market themselves in Philadelphia?
I'm not sure I necessarily have any, quote, solutions to this. And I get the fact that if you're offering a service, you want the public to know about it. But look, I mean, personal injury law is only one area of law, right? There's lots of other lawyers out there, the majority of whom probably don't do much advertising at all. So I'm not sure why personal injury lawyers have decided that they're just going to operate like any sort of Fortune 500 company and just market themselves relentlessly. So I'm not sure that I have a, quote, solution or alternative way of doing this, but I do think it's worthy of just sort of noting what's happening and having some sort of conversation about this, even within the legal profession itself. I mean, as I noted, I talked to a number of lawyers, many of them on background or off the record, who are really kind of offended by this, that they really do think it undercuts the idea of law as a profession and just makes lawyers seem like they're just out for a buck. And, that's not why many lawyers get into this. They really do think there is some greater public good that is served by a strong legal profession.
Similar to like Top Dog's jingles, there's also a particular style, like this crazy scenario. You're driving on 95. You get into an accident, you break your leg, you call your girlfriend, you like, girl, My leg is on the other side of the highway. It's so outrageous and sometimes kind of comical because it's these crazy narratives. And that's what sticks to me. And I feel like maybe that works. I don't know.
Oh, I think there's no question it works. It's like any advertising. First of all, if it gets your attention, that's effective, right? But secondly, if you remember it, and if it entertains you and you remember it, that's sort of like the gold standard for any kind of advertising. The other proof is that we keep hearing ads like this and keep seeing these billboards, and lawyers wouldn't continue to do this if it didn't work. So, in some ways, it's kind of reinforcing that the more they do this, the more cases they get. The more cases they get, they have more money. That leads to more advertising. So if I could go back to your last question for 1 second in terms of something that might change, one of the things that I think is kind of problematic and may even get close to whether it's ethical or not is that you have law firms that are advertising for clients, but in many cases, these firms are not even trying the cases, at least they're not predominantly trying these cases themselves. They are just getting this work and then they're farming it out to other lawyers. And I don't want to say it's a bait and switch, but it is right up to the edge of being misleading. I use the example in the story in the magazine of like one restaurant sort of advertising for something. And then when you call to make a reservation, they say, well, yeah, we can't take you, but I'm going to send you across the street to the guy across the street. I'm like, well, you advertise your name and your brand and your promises. Why are you suddenly shifting the office to somebody else? And, there are legal rules that technically disallow that. But my understanding is that the Bar Association sort of looks the other way on a lot of this stuff. So I think that's something that the Bar Association needs to take a look at and maybe clean up in some way if they possibly can.
I was raised by a lawyer and
so was I.
And I said, Dad, how come you're not on TV? And he just starts cracking up because, I was a kid. I didn't know. I was like, all the lawyers are on TV. Like, how come you're not on there? And he's like, oh, Trenae.
Well, it's funny. My dad was a lawyer, too. And I'm old enough that I remember when the Supreme Court lifted the ban on legal advertising. And my father was just like apoplectic. He couldn't believe that lawyers were going to suddenly have ads. So wow. I may have had his voice in my head as I wrote this story.
Tom McGrath, contributing writer for Philly Mag. Thank you so much for bringing the story to CityCast Philly.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this conversation about the billboards around the city, advertising personal injury lawyers, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. And be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly is talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.